The image on the screen is of a watercolor of my grandparents' Los Olivos ranch, which was painted by my grandfather's sister, Margaret Bush, in the early 1880s and became the label for the olive oil produced by the ranch. This two-story house was built about 1880 by a pharmacist, H.W. Smith. Located on a bluff above the Alamo Venado Creek, it had a view of the Coast Range to the south and the San Rafael Mountains to the north. In 1883, my grandfather, Alden March Boyd, moved from Albany, New York, to Montecito. Alden suffered from respiratory problems and was inspired by Charles Nordhoff's book on the healthful climate of the Santa Barbara area, where olive trees thrived. Alden left his diaries to my mother, who was raised in this house, which I used for this book. Alden's maternal grandfather, Dr. Alden March, was the founder of the Albany Medical College. His paternal grandfather, Robert Boyd, was the founder of the Albany Brewing Company, which relied on local barley and hops. By the 1790s, the Franciscans had planted Spanish olive trees in the Alta California missions. Commercial production of olive oil in Santa Barbara County began at Rancho Camulos, where Ignacio del Valle began selling oil from his press in 1871. In 1870, Elwood Cooper bought 2,000 acres from Colonel Hollister and planted olive cuttings for the Santa Barbara and San Buenaventura missions. In 1884, Alden rented the Forbes home in Montecito, and his neighbor Alston Hain had a nursery where he grew olives. That year, he drove Alden to the Santa Ynez Valley to view his ranch of 5,000 recently planted olive trees. Nearby were the Gould and Selby olive ranches. George Gould had a steam-driven olive press in Montecito, today remembered as Olive Mill Road. Hain drove Alden to the Joseph Cooper home, which was built around the historic Cota adobe on the 15,000-acre Santa Rosa Rancho near Lompoc. Cooper, a sheep rancher, purchased it from the widow of Francisco Cota in 1868. Today a county landmark, the home has been owned by director John Ford until 1969. The Lamb family of Rancho Los Amoles were friends whose property was near the Rancho San Julian. My grandfather purchased the Smith Ranch, which included a barn and 160 acres of unimproved land. In 1886, Alden's cousin Stuart Boyd bought the adjacent 160 acres parcel from the Browns, which included this adobe home with a porch that Margaret depicted. Olive trees must have previously been planted on the ranch, as the trees were yielding fruit by the late 1880s. We don't know if the adobe still exists. Margaret had studied drawing at the Albany Female Academy and probably knew the artist Henry Chapman Ford, who gave lessons in his Santa Barbara studio, and in 1883 published his etchings of the missions. Here is her drawing of the Santa Ynez Mission, where the building appears slightly more dilapidated than in the image by Ford. The Boyds visited the mission, where Alden knew several Native Americans, who he said at the time were San Jacinto Indians. When the Boyds visited the mission, there were several paintings hanging above the altar which are no longer there. His neighbors included the El Alamo Pintado guest adobe, which was bought in 1884 by two British gentlemen, Harry Durbin and Alec Alexander. In 1885, they built a second two-story adobe, which became a social gathering place. Alden purchased it in 1890, which we will return to later. Margaret's drawing shows young olive trees that were planted on Alden's ranch in 1885, and a photo a few years later shows much larger trees. The windmill in the background was used to pump well water fed by Alamo Pintado Creek. From this photo, Alden appears to have used the olive press on the ranch of his friend Ralph Selby, who was the son of the San Francisco mayor, Thomas Selby. This page from his 1888 accounting shows the pounds of olives from his ranch and those of his cousin Allen, Bergeron, and Selby. Alden met Margaret Alexander in Santa Barbara in 1885, and in 1889 they were married. The Alexander family had moved from Toronto to this home in Santa Barbara in 1884. In January 1889, Alden began his first term as 3rd District County Supervisor. As someone who experienced the stagecoach wading through the Santa Ynez River at the San Lucas crossing, he must have mixed feelings when he obtained funding for the first concrete automobile bridge at that spot. My mother, Joan, Alden's first daughter, was born in 1890 at Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara. When she was 2 weeks old, her mother took her on the stagecoach to Ballard. A passenger on the stagecoach was a prisoner who was dressed in a black and white striped suit and had a ball and chain attached to his ankle. He kindly held my mother in his lap. The journey on the 4-horse stagecoach from Santa Barbara to Ballard via the San Marcos Pass took almost a day. It stopped at Joseph Ballard's adobe before heading on to San Luis Obispo. This shows my mother and her sister Jessie with their parents on the steps of their home about 1898. Alden is depicted in the living room sitting near the fireplace. At that time, the population of the valley numbered about 500 souls. My mother recalled the silence. No cars, no planes, no phones, just bird calls, the brook, and coyotes calling to one another at night. She said she could ride her horse from the ranch to the mountains without encountering a fence. My mother walked or rode her horse from their farm to attend the nearby Ballard School. The family attended the Presbyterian Church, which was designed in 1882 by Sam Lyons, who served as Ballard's Justice of the Peace for many years. Trout were abundant in the Santa Ynez River, where my mother and her sister fished at San Lucas, while their Aunt Margaret painted a watercolor. Nahui Falls was another beloved picnic spot. Margaret drew my grandparents, my mother and her sister, as children sitting at the edge of Zaca Lake, watching a canoe slip by. Inspired by the success of the tavern built by his friend Felix Matty in 1886, to coincide with the arrival of the Pacific Coast Railroad in 1887. Alden built 3 guest cottages nearby. In 1890, Alden bought the Alamo Pintado and opened it as a guest ranch. He hired Hobson's 12-horse team to move the 3 cottages onto the property. By 1910, Felix Matty was the manager of the inn. After Felix died in 1930, Alden managed to keep the inn open through the Depression, but in 1937 he sold it to Samuel de la Cuesta in preparation for moving to Santa Barbara. The Boyds and their daughters were friends with Felix's son Clarence, who studied painting in San Francisco and Paris. Joan introduced him to her cousin Margaret Alexander Waterman. Felix met John Singer Sargent in London in 1905, and Sargent's charcoal portraits inspired him to make this drawing of Margaret in 1924. The family loved to drive up the dirt road to Figueroa Mountain, where the family hiked and camped. Another favorite summer outing was when Alden drove the family in the wagon to Ahoe Falls, where they sat on a large rock enjoying the cooling spray of the falls. Margaret's drawing of the falls shows a considerable flow of water. It had been part of the Correo Nohui Rancho, which by 1885 was owned by the Pierce brothers of San Francisco. They held rodeos at their Rancho Alisal, which the boys attended. In the summer of 1914, Alden organized a camping trip to Davy Brown's cabin in Sunset Valley, east of Figueroa Mountain. Alden probably knew the explorer Davy Brown, who was born in Ireland in 1800. He was a sailor and as a 49er scouted for Kit Carson. By 1895 he had to leave his cabin, which by 1914 was still standing by a brook. My mother Joan was on that trip, together with her cousins Camilla and Margaret Alexander Waterman. That was when she met her husband-to-be, Richard Bard of Wenatchee. My parents were married in 1916, and the following year my father served in France in the U.S. Artillery. I was born when my father was away, and my grandmother Margaret held me for this portrait by Santa Barbara photographer Carolyn Glenhill. My parents raised me on the Wenatchee property of my paternal grandfather, Senator Thomas R. Bard. My grandparents continued to run the ranch for almost 35 more years until they sold it and moved to Santa Barbara. Joan loved to return to the Santa Ynez Valley to see her beloved mountains, and said that the happiest day of her life was when she met Richard on Figueroa Mountain. We hope this presentation will encourage other researchers to help identify sites and locate images that we have not found. For example, this photo from the Boyd album shows a portion of the Santa Ynez Mission Aqueduct, with the mission in the distance top right, and many rows of recently planted trees in the bottomland. Could these be the olive trees planted by Selby, Gould, and Hayne in the early 1880s? If so, where was the Selby olive press that Alden and his brother used? In 1881, the Bishop of Monterey sold 16,000 acres owned by the Santa Ynez Mission, part of which must be depicted in this photo. We are seeking help in identifying the image of a house on a hill above what appears to be a portion of old mission watermill works and bears an inscription on the reverse, Santa Ynez, with a question mark. This photo may show remains of the Santa Ynez Mission water-powered grist mill built around 1820 thanks to Chumash workers. We assume that the mission used this grist mill also as an olive press, but we hope that mission historians will clarify that. We wonder if this photo might be of the Selby olive ranch with the olive trees and mission beyond the house on the hill. In 1884, the southern section of the Santa Ynez Mission collapsed, a part of which Margaret Bush depicted, although we have not located a period photo of that actual damage. During the 1880s, Chumash spiritual leader Rafael Solares also served as the mission sacristan, namely the person in charge of the contents in the buildings. It is likely that Margaret and Alden met him when they visited the mission. Undoubtedly, when Alden served as 3rd District Supervisor in the 1880s, he would have met Rafael Solares. We hope to find information about Alden's work as a county supervisor, his involvement with the Mission Indian Relief Act of 1891, and to learn more about Rafael Solares. In the 1980s, the Boyd home was moved to Los Olivos, and a small historic marker placed outside. My mother wrote in Santa Barbara's Historical Society publication, Noticias, quote, "I think my childhood must have been a happy one. There seemed so much to do. The hay rides, horseback rides, picnic and swims in the Santa Ynez River or Zaca Lake, picnics at Nohui Falls, the trips at Christmas time in the buckboard to the upper part of the Santa Aguada Canyon to get our Christmas tree, a digger pine. The long, hot summer days, lying in the hammock on the veranda and listening to the bells on the grain wagon teams as they went by on the road below our hill, lost in a cloud of dust. On those days, my father would keep the house completely closed, and the temperature outside would be 104 degrees, inside 64 degrees. And if anyone left the door open for a second, his voice would be heard shouting, 'Door!' We hope the images we have shown from the Boyd album will contribute to those previously gifted to the Santa Ynez Historical Museum by my mother Joan, such as this showing Alden driving his 2-horse buggy. My mother and her sister on ladders among the olive trees. Boyd Ranch and trees, which Alden continued to farm for another 30 years when age forced him to reluctantly retire to Santa Barbara. However, his heart always remained in the valley. He created a family plot in Ballard Cemetery, a public site he helped preserve as supervisor.